Rockland Palace, 1964. A ring girl slid a hotel key into Bumpy Johnson's hand right in front of 40 mob men. Nobody moved. Nobody warned her. Mae Johnson snatched it, read it once, and laughed. Not angry, not threatened. Just laughed cold enough to stop every heart in that room. That laugh erased a girl without touching her. To understand it, we go back to that night. Rockland Palace on a Friday night in 1964 did not smell like a boxing arena. It smelled like money sweating through silk. It smelled like cigar smoke so thick it stained the ceiling brown. It smelled like cheap perfume from women who understood that looking expensive was its own kind of weapon. And underneath all of it, beneath the bourbon and the hair grease and the leather shoes polished to a mirror shine, there was something else, something older, something that had no name, but every man in that building recognized the moment they walked through the door. It smelled like consequence. The crowd that packed Rockland Palace that night was not there for the boxing. Not really. The boxing was the excuse. The boxing was what you told your wife when she asked where you were going. The real reason every seat was filled. The real reason men drove in from Brooklyn and the Bronx and even from downtown Manhattan was because Rockland Palace on a Friday night was where Harlem decided things. Who was rising? Who was falling? Who was allowed to keep breathing past the weekend? The upper balcony was loud and drunk and alive in the way that people are alive when they finally have one night to forget everything pressing down on them. Women in red and yellow dresses leaned over iron railings and screamed names into the smoke. Men in shirt sleeves stood on their seats and threw programs into the air. The sound was enormous and continuous, a single animal roar that bounced off the low ceiling and pressed down on everything below like a hand pushing underwater. But the front row was different. The front row did not scream. The front row did not stand. The front row sat with the particular stillness of men who had already decided how the night would end and were simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. 12 chairs, 12 men in suits that cost more than most Harlem families made in 3 months. 12 faces that showed nothing, gave nothing, and missed nothing. Nobody in Harlem needed to be told what that front row meant. You learned it the same way you learned everything important in that neighborhood, not from being told, but from watching what happened to the people who didn't know. That was the room Ruby walked into at 9:47. She came through the side entrance wearing a white dress that caught every light in the building and refused to let it go. She was 23 years old, and she moved like someone who had rehearsed this entrance, which she had 3 times that afternoon in her Lenox Avenue apartment while the radio played, and she told herself, tonight was the night everything changed. She was the ring girl. Walk the card between rounds, hold it high, smile. Look beautiful. Disappear. Ruby had never been good at disappearing. She stepped onto the arena floor and felt 4,000 eyes find her simultaneously, and instead of dropping her gaze the way the other girls learned to do, she lifted her chin. She let them look. Attention was the only currency she fully controlled, and she had learned to spend it with precision. Her heels clicked against the concrete with a sound like a slow clock counting down to something. She had grown up 3 blocks from this building. She had watched women like herself work these same floors for years, hold the card, smile at men who never learned their names, then go home to apartments with broken radiators and children who needed new shoes for school. She had promised herself since she was 17 that she was going somewhere different, that her face and her ambition were a combination the universe was obligated to reward eventually. Tonight, she intended to collect on that promise. She passed the 2nd row without looking at anyone. She passed the 3rd. She was aware of the front row the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not by looking directly at it, but by feeling the heat change the quality of the air around you. She did not look at it yet. That was intentional. You did not look at the thing you wanted too soon. You let it feel your presence first. You made the room understand what was about to happen before you committed. Her card read, Round 3. She had until the bell. She held the card above her head, turned toward the crowd, and smiled the smile she had built over years of understanding exactly what men wanted to see on a woman's face. The balcony erupted, whistles and names, and a sound like a wave breaking. In the front row, not one head turned toward her. Not one. She felt that. In her chest, somewhere behind her sternum. She felt the specific cold weight of being looked through rather than at. But she did not let it show. She had learned early that showing what hurt you was the same as handing someone a map to everything you couldn't protect. She kept smiling. She kept walking. And in the center seat of the front row, 12 feet away, Bumpy Johnson watched the fight and put a cigar to his lips and breathed out a slow column of smoke that rose and disappeared into the dark above him. Some rooms have already made their decision about you before you take your first step inside. Ruby would understand that before the night was over. But right now, she was still 23, and certain. And the bell for round 3 had not yet rung. And she still believed the note folded inside her dress was going to change everything. Ruby had been studying Bumpy Johnson for 6 weeks before that night. And she had been careful about it the way you are careful around something you know is dangerous but have decided to touch anyway. Not following him. She understood the line between research and foolishness. But watching, listening, reconstructing him from the way other people behaved in his presence, the way a geologist reconstructs ancient events from the layers left behind. She had talked to a woman named Cecile who worked the bar at Club Baron on 132nd Street. Cecile had given her bourbon and information in equal measure, and the information was not gentle. She told Ruby about men who had made the mistake of crossing Bumpy Johnson and had subsequently ceased to appear in their usual places. She told her about the prison years, multiple stretches, serious time, and about the fact that he had come out of each one not diminished, but recalibrated, like a blade that gets sharper the more times you grind it. Cecile had told her all of this leaning across the bar with the specific expression of someone trying to save a person who has not yet decided they want to be saved. Ruby had listened to every word and felt none of it change her direction, because Ruby was not looking at Bumpy Johnson the way most people looked at him. Most people looked at him and saw the danger first. Ruby looked at him and saw the architecture underneath the danger, the position, the protection, the permanent elevation that came from being the man everyone else in Harlem had to account for. She looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw a door, and she had spent her entire young life developing the particular skill of finding the right key for whatever door she needed to open. What Ruby did not study carefully enough was Mae. Mae Johnson had been beside Bumpy for longer than Ruby had been forming coherent memories. She had been there through the Harlem numbers wars, through the years when getting home at night was not something you assumed would happen, through the stretches of incarceration that carved years out of both their lives and left them bonded in ways that people who have only known comfort cannot fully comprehend. Mae was not decoration. She was not sentiment. She was operational, the other half of the intelligence and discipline that had kept Bumpy Johnson alive and relevant through decades of the most unforgiving business in New York City. But Ruby looked at Mae and calculated age. She calculated time passing. She looked at Mae Johnson and saw a woman whose season, Ruby told herself, was winding down. People who watch from the outside almost always make that mistake. They see someone powerful go quiet and they call it fading. They have no way of knowing that the quiet is not retreat, it is precision. It is the difference between a fighter who swings at everything and one who waits for the single moment that matters. Ruby had written the note on hotel stationery stolen from the lobby of the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street, the building they called the Waldorf of Harlem, where everyone from heavyweight champions to foreign dignitaries had signed the guest register. She had used jasmine perfume because she believed the details of a gesture were what separated the memorable from the forgettable. She had written 12 words in careful block letters and folded the paper 3 times and tucked it into the fabric of her dress where her hand could find it without looking. She had rehearsed the approach, the angle of her body, the specific lowering of her chin that she had practiced in the mirror because she knew it made her eyes look larger. She had thought about this the way a chess player thinks about a sequence of moves, not just the first action, but the reaction it would generate and the action after that. She believed she understood the game. She understood a game, just not the one being played in that room. The game Ruby had mapped in her head was about desire and timing. It was about a beautiful woman making herself available to a powerful man in a way that felt like his idea rather than hers. That game existed. Ruby had played it before and won. She had used it to get out of situations that would have kept other women from her neighborhood permanently in place. But the front row of Rockland Palace was not playing that game. The front row was playing something that had been in progress for 20 years, with rules written in consequences that Ruby had no framework to read. In that game, a stranger approaching with a piece of perfumed paper was not bold. She was not intriguing. She was a variable that had not been accounted for. And unaccounted variables in that world carried a specific category of risk that everyone in the front row had long ago learned to neutralize quickly and without ceremony. Ruby did not know this. She was 23 and had survived everything her life had thrown at her through the force of her own nerve, and that survival had taught her the wrong lesson that nerve was sufficient for any room. She stood at the edge of the arena floor, fingers finding the note inside her dress, and the bell rang for round 3. She started walking. Behind her, the 2 fighters collided with a sound like a car hitting a wall. In the front row, 12 men watched her come toward them, and not one of them was smiling. And Ruby read their stillness as indifference when it was something else entirely. It was recognition. They had all seen this before. Different girls, different nights, different variations of the same miscalculation. And they all knew, before Ruby's heels had covered half the distance, exactly how this particular hand was going to be played out. The only question was who was going to play it. He had arrived at 9:07, and the building had registered it before most people consciously understood what they were feeling. This was not a metaphor. People who were present at Rockland Palace that night described it independently. In separate conversations, across years, the specific sensation of the room-changing quality when Bumpy Johnson walked through the main entrance, not going silent, not stopping. The noise continued. The crowd continued. The fighters in the ring continued their brutal work. But something in the atmosphere shifted the way a barometric pressure shifts before weather arrives. Something that the body detected before the mind had words for it. He was not the largest man in the building. He was not loudly dressed. He walked in wearing charcoal gray, a white pocket square folded into 3 points, shoes that reflected the arena lights back upward as he moved. He walked at a pace that suggested he had never once in his adult life been in a hurry, because the things he needed to arrive at would wait for him. Mae was on his left. Junibird was 2 steps behind and 1 step to the right. The crowd moved for them without being asked. That was the detail that people who had never seen it before always struggled to explain. Afterward, nobody cleared a path. Nobody made an announcement. Nobody was pushed or directed. The crowd simply understood, through some mechanism below conscious thought, that this particular group of 3 required space. And the space appeared. Mae walked beside Bumpy with the posture of a woman who had not needed to establish her position in this building for a very long time, because it had been established so thoroughly and for so long that questioning it had ceased to be a thought anyone had. She was dressed in dark blue. Not flashy, not understated in a way that suggested effort, just precise. She moved through the crowd the way someone moves through a familiar house in the dark, without hesitation, without checking. She knew every face in the front row. She knew their names and their histories and their specific varieties of loyalty and the conditions under which each variety held and the conditions under which it didn't. She had opinions about all of them that she kept private and shared only with Bumpy, in quiet, and only when those opinions were going to change something. Junie Bird said nothing and watched everything. 11 years standing behind Bumpy Johnson had produced in him a specific and highly refined skill, the ability to appear to be part of the room while simultaneously being the most alert and dangerous presence in it. He had already clocked Ruby when she came through the side entrance at 9:47. He had noted the white dress, the trajectory of her attention, the particular quality of her focus on the front row, and he had filed it in the category of things that would either resolve themselves or require a response, and he was waiting without urgency to see which. Bumpy sat down in the center seat and crossed one leg over the other, and a bourbon appeared in his hand from a man who materialized and then retreated so smoothly, the motion barely registered. He looked at the fighters in the ring with the focused patience of a man watching something he understood completely. Not entertained exactly, more like a craftsman watching other craftsmen work and seeing things in the work that the audience around him could not see. He had been watching fights in this building since before Ruby was born. He did not look like a man who needed anything from this room. He did not look like a man performing composure. He looked like a man for whom composure was simply the natural state, the resting condition, the thing that existed when nothing was requiring anything different from him. That quality, the absolute absence of performance, was what made him the most unsettling person to approach in any room he occupied. Most powerful men, if you watched them carefully enough, were always slightly aware of being watched, always calibrating the image they were projecting. Bumpy Johnson had passed through that stage so long ago it had left no trace. He simply was what he was, completely and without modification. And that completeness was its own form of warning to anyone paying close enough attention. Mae was paying attention to everything. She had seen Ruby the moment she walked in. The white dress was visible from 40 feet away, designed to be. She had taken in the girl's age, her bearing, the specific angle of focus directed at the front row, and she had understood the situation with the completeness that comes from having seen its variations play out more times than she cared to count. She said nothing. She did not touch Bumpy's arm. She did not alter her breathing or the position of her hands folded in her lap or the direction of her gaze. She simply recalibrated. This was something Mae Johnson had developed over 20 years of sitting in rooms where the difference between reacting too early and reacting at exactly the right moment was the difference between handling a situation and creating a spectacle. She had watched women approach her husband before. She had watched men approach him with intentions that were less honest than Ruby's and considerably more dangerous. She had developed a very specific understanding of when a situation required intervention and when it required only the patience to let the situation complete its own destruction. Ruby was completing hers right now, step by careful step across the arena floor. Mae watched her come. The fight in the ring had reached that middle brutal passage where both men were marked and slowing, and the crowd above was fully lost in it, screaming with the particular abandon of people who are watching violence they are not responsible for. The smell of blood had reached the front row copper and sweat, thin and specific above the cigar smoke and bourbon. Bumpy did not move. Mae's hands remained folded in her lap, and Ruby crossed the last 15 feet of concrete between herself and the front row, with the folded note between her fingers. Jasmine perfume rising off the paper in the hot arena air, completely certain and completely wrong. And the bell for the end of round 3 was 30 seconds away. In the front row, nobody spoke. Nobody gestured. Nobody warned her. They just watched her come. Because in rooms like that one, the most instructive lessons were always the ones nobody interrupted. Ruby reached the edge of the front row at the exact moment the bell rang for round 3. The timing felt like confirmation, like the universe punctuating her entrance with brass. She had always been good at reading signs, and she read this one the way she read everything as evidence that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. She turned toward the ring and lifted the card above her head and walked the perimeter the way she had done it 100 times before. Except that tonight, every step was calculated. Every movement aimed at the same fixed point, the way a rifle barrel locks onto a target before the finger moves. The crowd above was in full eruption. Round 3 had opened with both fighters throwing everything they had left. And the sound coming down from the balcony was no longer individual voices, but a single, compressed roar that felt physical, something you felt in your back teeth and your sternum simultaneously. Blood had been drawn in the second round, and the canvas showed it in dark spreading patches that the fighters stepped through without looking down. The way men who have accepted damage stop registering it as information. Ruby walked the card and let her eyes find the center seat. She had rehearsed this moment until it lived in her body, rather than her mind. She would look at him directly, but briefly, not a stare, not a full invitation, just acknowledgement, just enough to establish that she saw him and was not frightened of being seen seeing him. That was the opening move. Controlled, calibrated. She looked at Bumpy Johnson. He was watching the fight. Not her. The fight. His eyes were on the 2 men in the ring with the complete and undivided focus of someone for whom nothing else in the room constituted relevant information. He held his bourbon glass with 2 fingers at the base. The cigar in his other hand had burned down a precise inch. He sat with the stillness of a man who had never once in his adult life confused motion with authority. Ruby held the look for 3 full seconds. He did not turn. She had expected the flicker, the small involuntary shift that men produced when she directed her full attention at them. She had never once failed to generate it. Not in any room. Not with any man. The complete absence of it was so total and so clean that for one disorienting moment she genuinely questioned whether she had somehow become invisible between the side entrance and the arena floor. She completed her circuit and returned to the edge of the ring and stood with the card at her side and breathed through it. The front row felt different up close. From across the arena it had looked like power arranged in chairs. Up close it felt like standing at the edge of something that went considerably deeper than its surface suggested. The way certain buildings in Harlem looked ordinary from the street, and then you went inside and understood immediately that the street-facing facade was the least true thing about them. The men in those seats did not ignore her the way men ignore things they are choosing not to engage with. They ignored her the way a wall ignores you. She was not a variable they were suppressing. She was not a variable at all. Only one person in the front row had looked at her directly. Mae Johnson. Once. Approximately 2 seconds. A look so complete and so efficiently expressionless that Ruby felt it on her skin, the way you feel a temperature drop. Not painful. Not aggressive. Just suddenly and undeniably present. It was the look of someone who had already finished thinking about what they were seeing before Ruby had finished walking into frame. Ruby had been looked at by dangerous men. She had been looked at by men who wanted things from her that she had no intention of providing. She had been looked at by men who had tried to diminish her through the specific violence of their attention. Mae Johnson's look was none of those things. It was a look Ruby had no existing category for, and the absence of a category for it was what made it stay with her. Any sensible woman would have put the note back in her dress and found somewhere else to be. Ruby reached into the fabric of her dress and felt the folded paper between her fingers still warm. slightly damp from the heat of the room and her own body, and felt Bumpy Johnson's absolute indifference metabolize inside her chest into something that was not retreat and not recalibration. It was acceleration. She had been dismissed before, by teachers, by landlords, by men who had tried to file her into something smaller than she was. Every time someone had looked through her rather than at her, she had used it, disassembled the dismissal like a machine, and rebuilt it into forward motion. That was the engine she ran on. That was the thing that had moved her from a 3-room apartment on 118th Street to this arena floor, in a white dress with a hotel key and 12 words written in block letters on cream stationery. Bumpy Johnson's indifference hit that engine like fuel hitting a fire that was already burning. The bell rang, ending round 3. The fighters separated to their corners, and the arena noise dropped 1 register. Still enormous, but no longer at maximum pressure. And Ruby made the decision. Not next round. Now. Directly. She was going to walk to the front row, and she was going to deliver the note, and she was going to make Bumpy Johnson register her existence if she had to stand close enough to him that looking through her required deliberate effort. She did not see Mae's eyes track her from the left side of the row. She did not see Junie Bird shift his weight forward onto the balls of his feet with the unhurried readiness of a man who has moved from observation to preparation. She did not see anything except the center seat and the man in it, and the distance closing between them step by step. She started walking. In Harlem back then, everybody who sat in rooms like that one understood something that Ruby hadn't learned yet, that certain looks between certain people carried the full weight of decisions that never got written down anywhere. The look Mae Johnson sent across the front row at that moment was exactly that kind of look. Short, absolute, and older than anything Ruby was walking into. The distance from where Ruby stood to Bumpy Johnson's right hand was 15 feet. She covered the first 10 without incident, moving along the edge of the front row with the deliberate ease of someone who has decided that the only option remaining is forward. The between rounds noise had settled into a different register, still substantial, still pressing from above, but with a changed quality, less pure animal force, more the sound of thousands of people simultaneously catching their breath and deciding what they thought. It created a pocket of relative quiet in the front row. Not silence, just enough reduction in the ambient pressure that things could happen in those 12 seats without being immediately legible to the 4,000 people above. She was close enough now to smell the cigars individually. Not as a collective wall of smoke, but as distinct sources, the thin, bitter one from the far left. The dark, sweet one from the man beside Bumpy that reminded her, strangely and briefly, of her grandfather's house in Georgia when she was very small. She registered the smell and registered the memory, and then put both aside because this was not the moment for Georgia, and it was not the moment for anything except the next 5 feet. Bumpy was 4 feet away, then 3. He was still watching the ring where the cornermen worked on swollen eyes with small cold metal instruments, while fighters sat on their stools with their arms on the ropes and their chests heaving with the particular exhausted dignity of men who are hurt but not yet finished. He had not moved since she started walking toward him, had not shifted, had not recrossed his legs, had not brought the cigar to his lips. He existed in his chair with the permanence of something that had been placed there long before the building was constructed around it. Ruby stopped beside the seat. She was close enough to see the 3 precise points of his pocket square. Close enough to see the particular quality of gray at his temples that photographs never captured correctly. Not silver, but something darker and more specific. The gray of something refined by pressure over a very long time. Close enough that if he turned his head 4 inches to the right, his eyes would be level with hers. He did not turn his head. She lowered the card to her side. Her right hand found the note inside her dress warm. slightly soft from the heat of her body, and she drew it out in the smooth, unhurried motion she had practiced until it looked like nothing. Just a woman reaching for something she happened to have. Nothing significant. Nothing that required attention. The paper was cream-colored. Hotel Teresa watermark at the top. 12 words in the center in careful block letters, folded 3 times. The jasmine was strongest when the folds separated. She could smell it herself from this distance, which meant it had been doing its work in the air around her for the last several minutes, which meant every man in the front row had been smelling it too. She held the note at her side for one full breath. Then she extended her arm toward his right hand. 6 inches. In any other room, any other context, 6 inches was nothing. You cross 6 inches 100 times a day without registering it, handing someone a glass, passing a plate, returning change. 6 inches was the distance of ordinary human transaction. But the men in the front row knew what those 6 inches actually were. They had been in enough rooms over enough years to understand that distance is not a physical measurement in every context. Sometimes it is a threshold. Sometimes the 6 inches between one person's hand and another person's is the distance between a situation that remains manageable and a situation that requires the kind of management that leaves marks nobody talks about openly. Several of those men had personally witnessed smaller violations than this produce consequences that took weeks to resolve and left permanent alterations in the architecture of Harlem's arrangements. They knew what this 6 inches meant. They knew it the way they knew their own names, not because anyone had explained it to them, but because they had been paying attention, in the right rooms at the right moments, for long enough that it had become the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. Nobody moved. Nobody warned her. The note was 6 inches from Bumpy Johnson's hand, and the entire front row had changed temperature in a way that had nothing to do with the heat of the arena. Ruby held her arm extended. Bumpy's right hand rested on his knee with the bourbon glass balanced between 2 fingers. Completely still. He had not looked at the note, had not looked at her, had not in any visible way registered that something was being extended toward him from 6 inches away. But the rhythm of his breathing had changed. Not dramatically. Not perceptibly to anyone who hadn't been watching him with the specific attention Ruby had been directing at him for the past several minutes. But changed. A fraction slower. A fraction more deliberate. The breathing of a man who has noticed something and is choosing, consciously, not to respond to it yet. Ruby felt that changed the way you feel a current shift in water before you can see it on the surface. She should have taken the note back. Every functional instinct she possessed was producing the same signal: withdraw, pocket it, find the exit, reassess from somewhere that is not this specific 6 inches of space beside this specific seat. The signals were clear, and they were unanimous, and they were correct. She did not take the note back. She did not take it back because she was 23 and had built her entire operational identity on the principle that held ground was never surrendered. That retreat confirmed everything negative that anyone had ever assumed about where she came from and what she was capable of. She did not take it back because the alternative, walking away with the note still in her hand, having gotten this close and produced exactly nothing, felt like a kind of erasure she was not equipped to survive. She did not take it back because she still had not looked carefully enough at Mae Johnson's hands. Mae's right hand was already moving. Not fast, not with any quality that could be described as urgent or aggressive or even particularly purposeful from a distance. It moved with the economy of something that has been reduced, through long repetition, to its absolute minimum expression: no preparation, no visible decision point. Just the smooth completion of an action that had been decided upon considerably earlier than this moment. Mae's hand crossed in front of her husband's body from the left. It closed around the folded note in Ruby's fingers in a motion so quiet and so precise that the bourbon in Bumpy's glass did not register so much as a ripple. The paper moved from Ruby's hand to Mae's. Just like that. Bumpy Johnson did not move. Not his hands. Not his eyes. Not the angle of his shoulders or the position of his legs or the two-fingered grip on the bourbon glass. He sat in the center seat of the front row at Rockland Palace exactly as he had been sitting for the past 40 minutes, and he watched the fighters in the ring prepare for round 4, and he gave no outward indication that anything in his immediate vicinity had changed. This was the thing about him that no one who only knew him from reputation ever fully understood until they were in a room with him. His stillness was not suppression. It was not the stillness of a man holding something in. It was the stillness of a man who had long ago resolved the internal conflicts that produce movement in everyone else who had been through enough, survived enough, absorbed enough, that the ordinary provocations which caused other men to react had simply ceased to reach him at the depth required to generate a response. He had been watching fights in this building since 1941. He had sat in this specific row through negotiations that decided the direction of more money than most governments managed. He had sat here through insults and through challenges and through the various tests that men applied to other men in rooms like this one to determine the precise location of their limits. He had never once given anyone in this building the satisfaction of watching him react to something he had already accounted for. Junie Bird did not reach into his jacket. The general did not stand. The 11 other men in the front row did not make a sound or a gesture. They sat with the collective stillness of people who understand that the scene currently playing out in front of them is already being handled by the correct person, and that any additional movement from them would be, at best, redundant and, at worst, an implication that they didn't trust the person handling it. They trusted Mae Johnson completely. Every man in that row had, at some point in the years prior, witnessed Mae handle something, a conversation, a situation, a person who required redirection, and had come away with the specific understanding that her capability in these moments was not circumstantial. It was structural. It was the product of 20 years of operating in a world that had no patience for error and no interest in second chances. And it had produced in her a quality of response that most people in that row privately considered more reliable than anything else in the room, including the weapons some of them were carrying. Mae unfolded the note in her lap, slowly, without drama, the way you unfold something that belongs to you. The jasmine came off the paper strongly when the fold separated a young woman's perfume, sweet and deliberate and loud in the way of things chosen to be impossible to ignore. Mae registered it without expression. She held the cream stationery at the angle that caught the arena light best and read the 12 words once. She did not read them twice. 3 seconds. Complete understanding. No second pass required. She refolded the note along its original creases with the same unhurried precision and held it loosely in her left hand and looked up at Ruby for the first time since taking it. Ruby was still standing beside the seat with her arm in the extended position, fingers slightly open, in the posture of someone whose body had not yet received the signal from their brain that the transaction they had initiated was complete. She stood that way for what felt to the men watching from the row like a very long time. It was probably 4 seconds. In the front row of Rockland Palace on a Friday night in 1964, 4 seconds of that particular quality of silence was a considerable amount of time. Then Ruby's arm came down. She looked at Mae Johnson with something new in her expression, something that had not been there when she walked across the arena floor with the note in her hand. The calculation was gone. What replaced it was a look that the general, who had been in many rooms over many years, would describe to his nephew 2 decades later as the look of a person who has just understood that the map they were using was a map of a completely different city. Mae held Ruby's eyes for a moment without speaking. The arena above them was cycling back toward full volume as round 4 approached the cornermen stepping out of the ring, the referee calling the fighters to center, the crowd finding its voice again after the between rounds interval. The noise was climbing back toward that compressed animal roar, filling the space, pressing down. Mae let it build for a few seconds. Then she said, "You smell like the lobby of the Teresa." She said it quietly, conversationally, the way you note something that everyone in earshot can verify independently and therefore requires no particular emphasis. The jasmine on the stationery. The Hotel Teresa watermark. At the top of the note she had read both in 3 seconds, and she was letting Ruby understand exactly how completely she had been read. The general made a sound. Short. Controlled. The sound of a man acknowledging something without fully committing to enjoying it. Ruby said nothing. Mae looked down at the folded note in her hand, then back up. 12 words, Mae said. That's either very confident or very young. She said it without cruelty. That was the thing Ruby would remember longest. Not the words themselves, but the complete and genuine absence of cruelty in the delivery. Cruelty would have meant Ruby was worth the emotional expenditure. What Mae's tone communicated instead was something considerably more final, that Ruby was a situation being managed rather than a person being engaged with, that the difference between the two had already been determined before Ruby crossed the arena floor. Bumpy Johnson raised 2 fingers without looking away from the ring. The drink man appeared from behind the row. Fresh bourbon materialized in the glass. The drink man disappeared. The entire operation took 11 seconds. Mae watched Ruby during those 11 seconds the way you watch weather, with attention and without involvement. Then she placed the folded note on the armrest between herself and Bumpy, on her side, without comment. Not dramatically, not as a statement. Just put it where it was no longer the center of anything. Ruby looked at the note sitting on the armrest. She looked at Mae. She looked at Bumpy Johnson, who had still not moved and still had not looked at her, and had still not given any indication that he was aware of her existence in the immediate vicinity of his right hand. She looked back at Mae. Mae met her eyes with the expression of a woman who had already moved on from this conversation internally and was waiting, without impatience, for the external version of it to conclude. The men in the front row understood what they had witnessed. They had watched it unfold from 6 inches away: the approach, the note, the interception, the 4 words, the 11 seconds, the refolded paper placed on the armrest. They had watched Mae Johnson dismantle a situation in real time without standing up, without raising her voice, without disturbing the bourbon in her hand or the expression on her face. They had watched it, and they would remember it the way you remember things that happen in front of you that clarify, permanently, the correct hierarchy of a room. Nobody spoke. The bell rang for round 4. The 2 fighters came off their stools and moved toward each other with the grim momentum of men who had already absorbed the worst the other had to offer, and had decided it was not enough to stop them. Ruby stood at the edge of the front row with both hands empty. The note sat on the armrest beside Mae Johnson, and the most dangerous man in Harlem watched 2 other men hit each other and said nothing, because Mae had already said everything that needed to be said, and in 20 years of sitting beside him, she had never once needed to say anything twice. Mae Johnson laughed, not loudly, not with the full-throated abandon of someone who has lost control of their response. It was quieter than that and considerably more precise, a short, genuine sound that came from somewhere real. The way a laugh comes when something strikes you as actually, honestly funny, rather than when you are performing amusement for an audience. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. 3. It did not require her to shift in her seat or put down her drink or change the angle of her posture by a single degree. It was the laugh of a woman who had just read 12 words on a piece of hotel stationery and recognized in those 12 words something she had encountered before in various forms across 20 years. The specific overreach of someone who had mistaken proximity for invitation, who had walked into a room they did not understand and handed the most informed person in it a complete and detailed document of their own miscalculation. It was the laugh you produce when something is not threatening, when something is not even interesting enough to be threatening, when something is simply, precisely, exactly what it looks like. Young. The general heard it first. He was 2 seats from Bumpy on the right, and he had been occupying front rows long enough that he could read Mae Johnson's register of responses the way a card player reads a table instantly, automatically, with complete understanding of what the next hand would look like before it was fully dealt. He heard that laugh, and he knew in the same breath what it meant. And a smile moved across his face that he did not attempt to suppress because there was no reason to suppress it. The man to his left caught it next, then the man beside him. It traveled through the row the way current travels through a wire, not slowly, not with drama, just transferred from one point to the next at the speed of shared comprehension. By the time it reached the far end, 6 of the 12 men were smiling, and 2 were making the short, controlled sounds of men permitting themselves a measured acknowledgement of something genuinely worth acknowledging. Nobody laughed loudly. Nobody made a production of it. That was not how these men operated, and it was not what the moment required. What the moment required was exactly what it received: a quiet, collective, unanimous recognition that the situation had been read, handled, and filed, and that the filing was permanent. Ruby stood at the edge of the row and felt it move through the room like weather. She felt the laugh first, a small cold thing that landed on her skin, the way the first drop of rain lands before you understand a storm is coming. The kind that makes you look up before you know why. Then she felt the smile travel through the row like a slow current, and she watched 12 faces that had been professionally expressionless for the entire duration of her time in the front row produce, simultaneously, the specific look of men who have just watched someone walk confidently into something they could not see. She had been in rooms where people were angry at her. She had been in rooms where men looked at her with contempt or hunger, or the calculating appraisal of someone assessing usefulness. She had navigated all of those rooms. She had a working knowledge of how to move through spaces defined by those particular varieties of attention. She had never been in a room where she was funny. The distinction was not subtle, and it was not survivable in the way the others had been survivable. Anger meant you mattered enough to produce a reaction. Contempt meant you existed on the map as something to be looked down upon. Being funny, being the source of that quiet, genuine, shared amusement moving through the most dangerous front row in Harlem, meant something that existed below both of those. It meant you had been categorized beneath the level of serious consideration. It meant the room had already concluded its business with you while you were still standing in it. Ruby's face did not change. She had enough control of her features to hold the composed expression she had assembled before walking through the side entrance. She held it the way you hold something heavy when your arms are already past the point of comfort through will rather than ease. But her hands, hanging at her sides, had closed into fists. Mae looked at her through the tail end of the laugh, the trace of amusement still present in the corners of her mouth, genuine and unhurried, and said, to no one specifically and therefore to everyone within earshot. She used the Teresa stationery. The general's smile deepened by one controlled degree. Mae looked at Ruby directly. You know what I remember about being your age? Her voice was conversational, quiet, completely devoid of the heat that would have indicated Ruby had reached anything worth disturbing. I remember thinking the hardest part was getting into the right room. She paused, not for effect, but for the precision of someone who wants the next sentence to be the accurate version rather than the approximate one. Took me until I was 30 to understand that getting in was never the hard part. She held Ruby's eyes with the expression of a woman delivering a conclusion she reached long ago and has not revisited since. the oldest man in the row. Clarence, far left. 3 decades of front rows behind him said nothing. He reached into his jacket, produced a cigar, and lit it with the deliberate satisfaction of a man settling in after the main event has resolved exactly as expected. Years later, the men who were in that row would tell the story in different ways. Some remembered Mae's exact words differently. Some disagreed on small details, which round it was. Who laughed first? Precisely what was written on the note. Those details shifted depending on who was talking and how much time had passed, but not one of them, in any version, ever described that laugh differently. Every single account used the same words: cold, short, real. The kind of sound you don't forget because it doesn't come from performance, it comes from recognition. Ruby was still standing, still breathing. White dress still catching the arena, light the way it had been designed to catch it. Chin still at the practiced angle. Face still holding the assembled expression from the Lenox Avenue mirror that afternoon. But something had gone out behind it. The men in the row could see it, the way experienced people always see the moment when the force animating a performance withdraws from the performer, when the thing that had been holding the structure together simply leaves. And what remains is just the exterior. Still present, still technically upright, but no longer inhabited by whatever had been driving it through the arena floor and across 15 feet of concrete toward the center seat. Ruby was still standing in the front row of Rockland Palace. She had already left. She just hadn't moved yet. Mae stopped smiling. Not gradually. Not with a transition that gave you time to prepare for what came after. One moment, the trace of amusement was present at the corners of her mouth, and then it was simply gone cleanly. Completely. The way a light goes out, rather than the way a fire slowly dies. What replaced it was not anger and not coldness. It was something more neutral than either, and considerably more final. The expression of a woman who is determined that the courtesy portion of an interaction is complete and what follows will be direct. She held the folded note between 2 fingers. She extended it toward Ruby, not as an offer, not as conciliation or return. She held it the way you hold out something that belongs to someone else, and that you have no further interest in the specific body language of someone completing a transaction, rather than initiating one. Take it. We are done with this. Ruby took it. Her fingers closed around the paper and she registered, without wanting to, that it had cooled. It was no longer warm from her body, no longer carrying the temperature of the 6 weeks she had spent deciding this was a good idea. It felt smaller than it had felt in her hand before. The 12 words inside felt, in this moment, like a different quantity than they had felt when she printed them carefully on cream stationery in her apartment, with Marvin Gaye on the radio, and the absolute, unexamined conviction of someone who had not yet been wrong about themselves in any way that left a mark. Mae leaned forward in her seat, 1 inch, maybe 2, enough to close the distance to the point where what she was about to say could be delivered at a volume that would not travel past the edge of the row, not to Bumpy 14 inches to her left, not to the men on either side of him, not to the 4,000 people above generating the wall of noise that was currently providing the most private conversation Ruby had ever been pulled into without consenting to it. "You want to rob a bank," Mae said. "You don't hand a note to the banker's wife in front of the whole floor." She let it land. She gave it the 3 seconds it required to travel from Ruby's ears to wherever in Ruby's chest the things that actually mattered were located. She did not rush the pause and she did not fill it. She simply waited, with the patience of someone who has learned that the space after a true sentence is not empty. It is working. Then she said, "This is heavyweight business. Baby, you came in here with pocket change." She did not raise her voice, did not lean any closer than she already was, did not perform the delivery or adjust it for impact. She placed those two sentences in the air between them at the exact necessary volume and allowed them to do what accurate words do when they are spoken to someone capable of understanding them. Ruby's mouth opened. Nothing came out. This was not because Ruby lacked language. Ruby had never in her adult life been without language. She had talked her way into situations and out of situations that most women from her block never encountered and would not have survived if they had. She had refined language into a working instrument over 23 years of understanding that how you said something was frequently more decisive than what you said, that the right words at the right moment could move things that other forms of force could not move. But Mae's two sentences had arrived at a frequency that Ruby's responses could not locate. Not because they were cruel, not because they were delivered with the intent to wound, because they were true in a way that went underneath every defensive structure Ruby had built, every story she had been telling herself about who she was and where she was going, and what rooms she was equipped to walk into. Mae's words did not attack those stories. They simply made them briefly and completely transparent. Not armor. Not evidence of anything. Just stories a young woman had been telling herself in a Lenox Avenue apartment while the radio played. Harlem in 1964 was not a large place in the ways that actually determined what happened to people. It was small, the way all worlds defined by consequence are small, compressed, interconnected, with a memory that did not require documentation, because the people who carried it were still alive and still present, and still talking to each other every day. A sentence spoken in the right room traveled farther and arrived with more force than most other things. The men in the front row had built their entire operational understanding on that fact. Ruby was receiving her education in it now, in real time, in the most expensive classroom available. Mae held Ruby's eyes for a moment after the second sentence, not to observe the impact, not with any quality of satisfaction. With the focused attention of someone confirming that a communication has been received rather than deflected the way you hold someone's gaze after saying something important to make sure it landed where it was intended, rather than glancing off the surface. Then she leaned back. That lean back was its own complete sentence. It said finished, concluded. Whatever comes next for you comes next somewhere that is not here, and the question of where that is does not concern anyone in this row. She picked up her drink. She looked toward the ring. Bumpy Johnson had not moved during any of it. Ruby looked at him not with the calculated, directed attention she had been training on him all night. Not with the practiced look assembled in the Lenox Avenue mirror, but with the raw, unfiltered look of someone who has just received an education that cost everything she brought into the room and is still processing what she owes. He was watching the fight. He had been watching the fight the entire time, through the approach, through the note, through the interception, through Mae's laugh and Mae's two sentences, and the return of the cream stationery. He had watched the fight with the complete and uninterrupted attention of a man for whom the sequence of events that had just occurred in the adjacent 6 inches of space had been handled by the correct person, and therefore required nothing from him. Not a glance, not a shift of weight, not a single degree of movement in any direction. Ruby stood with the refolded note in her hand, the 12 words, the Jasmine, the Hotel Teresa watermark, and she understood, with the completeness that comes only from direct and personal experience, that Mae's 2 sentences had been the most precise thing spoken in this building all night, and that the most complete part of the lesson was the man who hadn't needed to say anything at all. Ruby left the front row the way smoke leaves a room when a window opens without announcement, without a single moment you could identify as departure, simply present and then not present. The space she had occupied already closing behind her as though the air itself had no record of her having been there. She did not look back. The white dress caught the arena lights one final time at the edge of the corridor, and then it was gone, absorbed into the crowd, and the smoke and the particular darkness that collects at the margins of any space where the light is concentrated at the center. The men in the front row did not watch her leave. This was the final and most complete form of what had happened to Ruby tonight. Not the laugh, not Mae's 2 sentences, not even the moment the note moved from her fingers to Mae's. The most thorough erasure was this: that 12 men who had tracked her entry with the automatic attention of people whose survival depended on knowing exactly who occupied any room they were in, simply did not bother to register her exit. She had traveled, in the span of 1 boxing round, from variable to irrelevance. Nobody spoke about what had happened. In rooms like that one, the things that were understood did not require discussion. Every man in those 12 seats had watched the same sequence from the same distance and arrived at the same understanding simultaneously. Talking about it would have suggested the meaning needed explanation, which would have been its own insult to the woman who had provided it without standing up. Mae placed her hand on Bumpy's, without looking at him, without shifting her attention from the ring. She placed her hand over his with the ease of someone performing an action so deeply habitual it required no more conscious direction than breathing. Bumpy looked down at it. 2 seconds, maybe 3. With an expression the men nearby could not have accurately described to anyone who hadn't been present, not tender in any soft sense, not sentimental, but something older than both. The expression of a man looking at something that had been beside him through every event that made him what he was, and understanding, in the way that requires no language, exactly what that means. He turned his hand over beneath hers and his fingers closed around it, not with urgency, not with tightness, just with the complete, settled grip of someone holding something they have known the value of for 20 years and have never once confused with anything lesser. He did not speak. Then Bumpy raised 2 fingers on his free hand. The drink man appeared. 3 glasses of bourbon were placed with precision, one at Bumpy's right, one before Mae, one for Junie Bird, who stepped forward and received it with the brief nod of a man who understood exactly what was being communicated and needed nothing further. No toast, no words, no acknowledgement that anything had occurred tonight that differed from any other Friday at Rockland Palace. Just 3 glasses from a man who had spent 20 years understanding which gestures carried weight and which were noise. Clarence, at the far end of the row, drew on his cigar. 20 years, he said quietly, to no one in particular. Nobody asked what he meant. Nobody in that row needed to. The bell rang, ending round 4. The arena exhaled, and the front row sat in its 12 seats in the bourbon and the smoke and the noise of a Friday night in 1964, unchanged, complete, as if nothing had required handling, and no girl in a white dress had ever crossed the arena floor at all. Every man in that row carried the memory of that night for years, and every one of them, in every version of the story they told, said the same thing when they reached the end: that the most dangerous person in the room was not the man everyone came to see. It was the woman beside him who never needed to stand up. The fight ended sometime after midnight. The crowd went home. The smoke cleared. Rockland Palace went dark the way it always did, without ceremony, without acknowledgement of what had happened inside it. But Harlem remembered. Not the boxing, not the blood on the canvas. What Harlem remembered was a woman who sat completely still while everything moved around her, who held a folded piece of hotel stationery for 30 seconds and returned it without a word worth repeating, and in doing so, protected something that no lock and no gun had ever protected as cleanly. Ruby was never seen in the front row again. Mae Johnson sat in that same seat for years afterward, beside the same man, in the same stillness, and nobody ever made the same mistake twice. If this story stayed with you, There are more where it came from, stories from the room's history forgot to document. The ones that never made the papers. Subscribe and you will be there when we open the next one. And before you go, tell me what you think. Was Mae Johnson the most powerful person in that room? Or was her power only possible because of who was sitting beside her?